Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally. My other half, Sean Griffiths, is out this week. Now, we've recently been talking a lot about the rise of populism on the right, both in the United States and abroad. But what about the populist left? Donde está? I'll tell you, Donde, no está aquí. We're going to talk about that. But first, I think it's important for me to introduce today's guest co-host. You know, sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the glitz and glamour of nonpartisan political podcasting and forget about the regular people. And so today, I've invited regular guy Jack Eckblad to join me. Regular guy Jack Eckblad, how are you doing?
Doing great, Dan. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back.
It is wonderful to have you. Note, when we were first starting out this podcast, we did a bunch of episodes in the beginning. Jack was gracious enough to join me. I was gracious enough never to edit the episode or publish it. So I'm really appreciating you coming back on. And for
ostensibly the first time. Sorry.
There we go. Great. This is going on. The second thing I have to state is for you, Jack. Again, I'm wearing my Mars Cheese Castle t-shirt, giving a nod to the great state of Wisconsin. And I guess too, before we jump into the subject matter, could you just introduce yourself to the listener?
Yeah, so my name is Jack Eckblad. I am actually the holder of a nonpartisan office. I am the county supervisor for Milwaukee County District 4. And my background is I've been a trained progressive organizer for the last 15 going on 16 years now. Getting old, Dan. So my background, just for listeners' context, I consider myself progressive, but the places that I've worked on campaigns have been decidedly not progressive. So I've worked in rural Wisconsin. I've worked in the parts of Queens, New York that voted for Trump. So I've been a progressive in places where it's not easy.
Yeah. He's out there doing the work while I'm shooting off my big fat mouth. So thank you very much, Jack. And I thought you'd be a really good person for the subject that we have today. I think before we get into that, though, typically we start off each episode with a little item from the news. I don't think we can go without mentioning Trump's press conference, which let everybody know we are starting exactly where we left off. In his press conference, he talked about, again, Canada as a 51st state and annexing Greenland, which, for months now, I've been saying the key to lower grocery prices is annexing Greenland. So I'm glad to finally get some validation and all that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Jack.
I mean, we're back to distraction. While we're talking about Canada as a 51st state and annexing Greenland, none of which is going to happen, we are actively seeing legislation before the U.S. Senate to mandate the expulsion of undocumented immigrants who are charged, not found guilty, undocumented immigrants who are even charged with minor offenses. There are going to be policies that are having very real negative impact on everyone's quality of life. Mm-hmm. Greenland and Canada's the 51st state probably isn't the top of the list.
I would agree there. I would agree. Another thing I wanted to ask you about as well is, obviously we're just coming off an election. Wisconsin was a pivotal state.
Yep.
Why don't you give me your opinion as to what happened? Because you were there on the ground talking with voters.
Yeah, in fact, Bayview, my neighborhood, the wards around my house that I represent, had the second election in a row, including spring of 24, where we had the largest turnout and the largest get out the vote operation in the state of Wisconsin. So not only do we vote, but we meant it. We meant it. I think my ward has a turnout of 95%, even for a spring election. So we had a good idea of how folks were engaged. I think there's two things I'd point out to anyone who wants to do an analysis. From a 40,000 foot macro level, it's important to recognize that the Democratic Party did not go through a democratic process to select our presidential nominee. And that's not even shade thrown at the vice president. That's just a reality. We did not have a democratic process. Second, from a Wisconsin perspective, we had brand new maps in the legislature. And we figured we could gain about 14 seats between the Senate and the Assembly if Kamala won, and that we would also reelect Tammy Baldwin, who I think is one of the greatest U.S. senators in the history of the chamber. A little bias there. Mm-hmm. We picked up 14 seats. Tammy Baldwin was reelected to the U.S. Senate, arguably one of the most progressive, not the most progressive U.S. senator, and Kamala lost Wisconsin. So that tells you that there's this disconnect between the top of the ticket and the bottom of the ticket in Wisconsin, at least. And I would point to U.S. Senate races in Arizona and Nevada as other examples of that disconnect.
Well, here's my thinking, and I've said this before on this podcast, which is we had a very unpopular incumbent who arguably was senile, right? And he was replaced by somebody who had 3 months to mount a national presidential campaign.
100 days.
And Trump couldn't win the popular vote. Couldn't win the majority of the popular vote in Wisconsin. Could not win the majority of the popular vote in Michigan. And so to me, there are kind of two things. Number one, this was clearly, to me, an election about the economy. This was clearly a referendum on the incumbent party, which presidential elections typically are. Number two, like, shame on Trump for not being able to do better than that, because I think any other candidate would have been able to run away with it. But I'm really interested in what you said about Democrats in Wisconsin performing better than Kamala Harris did in the state. Is there a disconnect between the National Democratic Party and the grassroots, would you say, in a state like Wisconsin, for example?
Oh, without a doubt, there's a disconnect there. I mean, and we can see it on a number of levels. The talking points that demographics are just going to go our way. Well, we lost the Texas border counties for the second time ever since LBJ, the last 2 elections in a row. We've seen Trump grow his coalition within the Latino community year over year. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to start dissecting the disconnect there. We translated Kamala Harris's literature into Spanish in Wisconsin. Great. Congratulations. We've proven that we kind of know a second language. If you look at the Republican GOP outreach, they are opening offices in the state of Wisconsin. If you look at Rick Scott in Florida, he has an amazingly targeted program for Venezuelans, Hondurans, Cubans, Mexicans, etc. in the state of Florida, and he handed that off to Trump. And a lot of this was invented by independent expenditure groups like Turning Point USA. There is a disconnect between who the Democratic Party nationally wants to speak to and those groups, period. I think that much we know.
So what do you think, what are the Republicans doing better with those groups?
Well, if we look at Republicans nationally, they're doing better at micro-targeting different segments of what we would call the Latino or the Hispanic community. You know, they understand there's a difference between Venezuelans, Cubans, Mexicans, etc. This is not a monolith. When the Democratic Party talks about how racist Trump is around Hispanics, they're not factoring in the reality that the majority of the border patrol along the Texas border is Hispanic Latino. Those are the folks staffing it. And there is a lot of pride in that community around folks who came here legally and have an immigrant story, and they want folks to come here legally. So the immigrant story that the Democratic Party wants to tell and treat as the monolithic narrative within the Hispanic community, it just isn't. It's not the reality there.
Do you think there's a class divide in how the Democrats speak to people? Because I think, and we'll probably get into this as we veer more into the discussion around populism, but over the last few decades, the Democrats have become a largely urban party. They've become a party of those who have higher education levels. That's, again, not to say Republicans are dumb. Don't read into that. It's just when it comes to degrees, the Democrats have more degrees than the Republicans. It's just the way it is. So do you think there's a class divide between that group and the group of people they're trying to speak to?
Well, let's look at some high level numbers and then kind of dig into the rhetoric here. For the first time ever, I believe, and listeners can fact check me on this, Democrats won folks making over $100,000 per year, and Republicans won folks making $50,000 or less. That's the first time that statistic has been true in a presidential election at large. Mm-hmm. So is there a class divide? That number would certainly suggest there's a class divide. I also think there's a reality in terms of rhetoric where Democrats spent a long time telling the entire country that Joe Biden was not too old to do the job for 4 more years, and did not have an answer for, well, what if he is, though? And it turned out on national television, he was absolutely too old to do the job. And we had already sunk our credibility because we figured folks would just take us at our word. And we thought no one could kind of see that 80 is still 80. And it didn't matter that we were running against someone who was also an old guy because we didn't have a good answer.
I think what led to Biden's victory the last time around, in part, was the idea of a steady hand holding the wheel.
Oh, yeah.
Right? The Democrats, I mean, and you're going to disagree with me on this, but I think to your swing voter, to the people who actually are going to make a difference in the election, to the people who are actually going to tilt an election one way or the other, I think they were less sold on policy and more sold on the idea that we're not going to have a president telling us to inject bleach into our veins to fight COVID. Like, I think that was a big part of Biden's appeal, was that he was normal and that he would really provide some steady leadership, really make the presidency kind of boring again. And I think the steady hand moniker, I think the steady hand veneer sort of fell apart after that first debate. I mean, that was terrible.
That if there's a worse performance in a presidential debate, no one recorded it, right? I think from a populist standpoint, Dan, let's take a look at what problems folks were trying to solve in 2020 versus 2024.
Yeah.
In 2020, the streets were on fire. People were scared to leave their house. And the solution that the GOP was offering, that Trump was offering, was inject bleach and pour gasoline on it. That was the solution. And the Democrats said, I think we can do better than that. And folks voted for that because they thought, all right, let's give them a chance.
Yeah.
And I think steady hand plays into that. In 2024, the cost of groceries, the cost of rent, which I don't think made it into the Democratic rhetoric almost at all, unfortunately. You know, and nationally, we saw rent go up 20%, I think, on average. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, there is substantial anecdotal evidence that it went up more like 30 or 40%. People are hurting. We're facing a homeless issue, in an unhoused issue in Milwaukee like we've never seen before. And it's not because people don't want to be inside, right? And that just didn't make it into the rhetoric at all. The solution that Democrats were offering was to talk past it. And people lost patience with it, understandably.
I think the Democrats had to walk a tightrope between addressing economic issues without making it sound like the current administration had done a bad job. Right? I think there was this tightrope of how do we talk about inflation? How do we talk about the cost of housing without making Joe Biden look bad? That was number one. And I think the easy card was to just play, Trump is crazy. And, Trump is crazy already won in 2016. So it's not exactly like a winning strategy. But I think there's also a question of what are they selling and what are people buying? And this is something we talk about a lot on this podcast. So what we do is we'll actually break America's electorate up into 4 different quadrants. And you've got your traditional progressives, socially and fiscally liberal in one corner, your conservatives, socially and fiscally conservative in another corner. You've got your libertarians who are socially liberal, fiscally conservative. They're a small freakish group of which I'm kind of part of. And then you've got the populists. These are folks who are socially conservative and fiscally liberal. So they actually like, when asked, democratic economic policies, right? That's actually what they prefer. But they also kind of prefer the cultural language of the right now. And I think what they got in this election was one candidate giving the cultural message of the right and another candidate kind of dismissing the cultural language of the right. And I think that in a lot of ways, maybe they played right into Trump's hands because I hate to say it, people weren't turned off by the stuff he said about Haitian immigrants, for example. That wasn't a deal breaker.
Well, they'd heard it before. There's a certain amount of desensitization, any level of branding. I think there is a dismissal. And, on the ground with Democratic activists, there is this disconnect of how could anybody vote for Trump?
Mm-hmm.
And when your grocery bills are going up and you're looking for a solution, yeah, like, and there's only two choices. And I think it gets back to the differentiation when we talk about Democrats in this conversation the last couple minutes. What we really mean is the Democratic National Committee and the Kamala Harris campaign, the Harris-Walz campaign. When you dig further, you dig into the campaigns run by Gallego in Arizona and Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin. These are two states that Trump won pretty handily. I mean, he won Wisconsin by a solid margin. It was a thin margin, but it always is in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Their campaigns were about bread and butter issues. They called out inflation. For months, you saw press release after press release from Tammy Baldwin, Wisconsin, talking about manufacturing, American manufacturing first, delivering for dairy farmers, the bread and butter of what it means to be a populist progressive. You didn't see a ton of that from the top of the ticket in Wisconsin, especially the closing argument. The closing argument was, from the Kamala Harris campaign was, I will stand on the ellipse, remind you of January 6th, and tell you that we absolutely cannot have Trump, therefore pick me.
And this kind of gets to the root of the question I wanted to ask today, which is populism is clearly winning in the Republican Party. The populist faction, the MAGA faction, is clearly the majority. They're not the whole party, but they're the majority. Why is it that the populist wing of the Democratic Party hasn't become ascendant? Why is it that people like AOC or Bernie Sanders, people who are a bit more polemic, but also maybe more in the spirit of what voters are looking for, why have they kind of remained on the sidelines while the MAGA movement has just flourished?
Well, let's return to the point that the Democratic Party didn't go through a democratic process with a small d to get to our nominee this time. And if you look at the primaries in 2016 and 2020, you see the ascendance of populist policies from the left. Now, what you see is the mainstream Democratic Party adopting those policies and translating them into our wider coalition. It's worth noting that Bernie Sanders, for all of his success in transforming the Democratic Party agenda, didn't grow his coalition between 2016 and 2020. In fact, he did a little bit worse in terms of its mix. But we were able, as a party, to translate those policy priorities into a broader coalition. We didn't even have that chance this time around. We spent the entire time trying to convince folks that Joe Biden wasn't too old.
Do you think the Democratic nomination process when it comes to presidents stands in the way? Because the one key difference between the Democratic and the Republican Party is that the Democrats have these unpledged superdelegates. And of course, like, the talking point is that the superdelegates ultimately aren't going to override the popular vote.
We saw that in 2008 with Obama.
Yeah. So I guess, like, what's your feeling there? Do they do too much to maybe tamp down the desires of the rank and file in their presidential nomination process?
I mean, in 2024, they certainly did. The Democratic Party tamped down any sort of vote on an alternative. Mm-hmm. And that, to be really clear, gets back to Joe Biden. That mistake is Joe Biden's and Joe Biden's alone. And I can sing the praises of his policy agenda, and I will, to the extent that he deserves it, because I think there was a lot of good done. But when it comes to the decision of Joe Biden to run for a second term, it was a mistake, and no energy should be spent from the Democratic Party trying to apologize for it.
There's that, and I think that partially explains another problem I think a lot of voters have, which is it's not clear what the Democratic Party platform is exactly, right? Like, do you think there's been so much time spent in, for example, 2020 just beating Trump, and in 2024 propping up Biden's candidacy, that maybe they've lost sight of actually how to speak to voters in a way?
Well, in 2020, let's be really clear, we had a record to run against. And it wasn't just defeat Trump. It was, we believe in science. We believe that there's a way to manage our way out of a pandemic. We believe that there is an economic platform here that can rescue folks, and that there's a role for government to play in bettering folks' economic future. And to a large extent, the Democratic Party actually executed on that policy. I mean, if you look at developed economies throughout the world, the U.S. recovered better than China from the pandemic.
Yeah.
So that there's a record of success there. If you look at what we ran on in 2024, it was Joe Biden's not too old. Joe Biden's not too old. Oh, he's too old. Don't vote for Trump. Whatever you do, don't vote for Trump.
Yeah.
And I think that was the entire arc of our narrative. Were there other issues that we wanted to touch on, like a woman's right to choose? I think Sarah Isger had a really good point about whether or not referendums for a woman's right to choose would be net beneficial or net detrimental to Kamala Harris in battleground states. And I think she read it cold. Said anybody who has the choice of voting to prop up their right to health care is then given full permission to vote for Donald Trump for president because they've just propped up their own right for health care. The woman's right to choose is no longer a reason to vote against Trump, even acknowledging his track record on the issue. So I think no matter how you break it down, the narrative in 2024 from the Democratic Party was Joe Biden's not too old. We don't need a democratic process to suss out an alternative. And then once that fell through, it was don't vote for Trump. And both of those turned out to be losing arguments.
Something we've talked about a lot on this podcast, I'd be interested in your comments, is we talk about how the Democratic Party is actually a stronger party in the institutional sense. So when you go back to 2016, in my mind, you had a very weak Republican Party. They had just come off of 2012. That was a disaster. They had done this whole post-mortem on how they were going to open up the party. And Trump just kind of came in and inhabited that party like a hermit crab and figured out a way to make the system work for him, ultimately won the primary with a plurality, not a majority, but ultimately over time was able to craft the party in his image, right? That's the result of a weakened party. The Democrats as an institution are much stronger in my mind, right? As a party, they're much better able to enforce party discipline. They're much better able to control their rank and file. And in a lot of ways, in a time like now, I almost feel like that might be a weakness. Because again, when we get to the subject at hand, which is why is it that there is a populist right, but not a populist left? I think you could argue that it is this strong institution that is keeping those populist tendencies at bay, but also doing some things that are really killing their chances of winning, such as propping up Biden or just ramming through Harris's candidacy when it's clear that Biden isn't fit for office. What are your thoughts there?
I mean, no wing of the Democratic Party was even consulted outside of DNC headquarters for either of our presidential nominees through the last cycle. No one outside of the DNC was consulted about whether or not Joe Biden should be the nominee. No one outside of the DNC was consulted about whether or not Kamala Harris should be the nominee. We didn't have a democratic process. If you look at the 2016 and 2020 primaries, you see an ascendance of what I would call progressive populism, where there is a role for government to play in crafting a solution. I mean, if you look at the original populist platform of the Populist Party in the late 1800s, you see that the interests of rural and civic labor are the same. Their enemies are identical. There will come a time where corporations will either own the people or the people will own the corporations. In this sense, they were talking about the railroads. But they even talked about government coming in and redistributing land. There's a role for government to play. And you see that ascendance in the Bernie Sanders, the AOCs, the progressive populists coming up in the primaries of 16 and 20. The populism of the right is a lot more opportunistic and a lot more anti-government, period. And we're going to see the results of it in the next 4 years. What I try to remind folks of is we know what this looks like in terms of actual policy, whether you call it populist or not. They tried to replace Medicaid with block grants, which would bankrupt Medicaid, to be really clear. Like, if you're not fully up on Medicaid policy, you can absolutely be forgiven. Turning Medicaid into block grants would essentially bankrupt it and strip healthcare away from tens of millions of people. That's Trump, quote unquote, populism, is stripping healthcare away from the poor. I reject the idea that there is a populist right and not a populist left, though I can see where someone would get that impression. The populist left was denied electoral access in a primary this time around.
So that kind of jives with what I was thinking. I also think one thing I'll note here in terms of how the Republican Party has morphed over the years, it was really, I think, Reagan who solidified the coalition of wealthy people looking to protect their economic interests, or wealthier people, and then culturally conservative folks primarily in the South as well. And I think that's really when the Republicans started to develop this stronghold in rural parts of the country, where I think their cultural messaging resonated. Of course, income inequality increases. There are fewer rich people to vote for you. And so that doesn't necessarily carry as much weight. And so they really started to rely on this cultural narrative. And I think the interesting thing about what's going on now is that what the Republican Party is selling is they are selling this cultural narrative, this cultural conservatism. And again, that is something that is very appealing to people who might go either way. I think the other interesting thing I'd note about the folks who fall in that populist quadrant is that they're also mistrustful of government. So even though the Democrats might have a more compelling economic message, they're still less trustful that it's going to get done. Do you sense that? So when you're talking to, again, voters who might fall in either direction, do you sense that there's this mistrust, or there's this disbelief that government is going to do anything? And if so, how do you sell them on the idea that government can do something positive for them?
So one of the things that I really love about local government is we have the opportunity to demonstrate government's presence in everyday lives. So my position is part-time. It has a lot to do with parks, a little bit to do with transportation. But if you think about quality of life in a place like Milwaukee County, we have amazing county parks. We need to keep them functioning. We need to rejuvenate them so that folks see government coming in, and as mundane as it sounds, building a jungle gym, building some monkey bars and a slide. We need the buses to show up on time to get folks to work. We need them to see government working for them. And I think when it comes down to quality of life, folks want to see government working for them and improving it. No matter who you are. I'm not entirely sure what the disconnect is, but I think treating Republican voters as if they just don't get it is not a winning strategy. The goal of any political movement is to meet people where they're at. And there needs to be a reckoning in the Democratic Party of how we meet folks where they're at. And by the way, not holding a competitive primary, I don't know if I've harped on this enough in this episode, not holding a competitive primary, probably the wrong way to go about it.
Yeah. And I think that what I'm picking up here too is that the Democrats' resistance to this populist wave seems to be less a factor of any sort of demographic shift or anything like that, and more a factor of how the Democratic Party is structured and how they go after voters. And it seems to me, and you just tell me if I'm wrong here, that this whole image of this effete group of people residing in America's coastal urban enclaves dictating the strategy and the policy for people in other parts of the country is partially true. It's partially correct that the national apparatus of the Democratic Party isn't necessarily of the people or with the people that they're trying to court. And it doesn't sound like they're listening to them. Am I wrong?
I think that's true of both parties to a certain extent. I think that when we talk about the Democratic Party, let's be really clear, we're talking about the Democratic National Committee. Mm-hmm. If you look at the efforts of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, the Arizona Democratic Party, the Nevada Democratic Party, the Michigan Democratic Party, these state parties are running full court presses.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate dynamic, if you dig into the infrastructure around a national campaign, is once you take the DNC's money in a presidential year, you have to do what the DNC says. And I'll give you an example. We had a constitutional amendment on the ballot in November here, and we were told explicitly by the National Party, don't talk about the constitutional amendment. It's taking oxygen out of the room to talk about Kamala. If you're sitting in a room in Virginia or New York as part of the DNC, that logic makes sense. If you're trying to galvanize votes in Milwaukee or across Wisconsin, there's a disconnect there.
Would you say that the progressive populist movement is alive and well, and it's just being tamped down?
I would say that progressive ideas, when given a chance in the court of public opinion, win in a Democratic primary, and they make our candidates stronger as a result. We just lost the presidential election. We squeaked by with Tammy Baldwin, thank heavens, in Wisconsin. I don't know that we elected profoundly progressive folks who would pass a litmus test or a purity test from an ideological standpoint in Wisconsin, but we certainly moved the needle. And I think if we see a competitive primary in 2028, which we will for the Democratic Party, we will once again see progressive populist policies win out, no matter who the nominee is.
All right, man. I think we are going to end it there. Jack, thank you for joining me. Regular guy Jack Eckblad. Thank you for listening to Middleweight Politics. Theme music courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. If you liked what you heard today, please rate this episode, write a review, and share it with anyone you think might need to hear it. Thanks again for listening, and stay purple.